Marcus Williams had always believed that serving in the U.S. Army was the highest form of honor. Growing up in a modest neighborhood in Atlanta, Georgia, he had listened to his grandmother's stories about the struggles their family had endured, how his great-grandfather had fought in World War II, only to return home to a country that still treated him like a second-class citizen. But Marcus had always dreamed of being part of something bigger, of proving that skin color didn't matter when it came to courage, loyalty, and sacrifice. When Marcus first arrived at Fort Bragg for basic training, he was full of nervous excitement. He was 24, tall and broad-shouldered, with a quiet confidence that came from years of working hard and staying out of trouble. His grandmother's voice echoed in his head as he stepped off the bus, "Keep your head high, baby. They can't take your pride unless you let them." But that sense of pride started to chip away almost immediately. From the moment he entered the barracks, Marcus noticed the glances, the sideways looks, the whispers when he passed by. It wasn't the kind of overt racism he'd read about in history books, but it was there, in the smirks, in the way they said his name like it left a bad taste in their mouths, in the subtle exclusion from group conversations. The other recruits in his unit were mostly white men from all over the country: Brad Coleman, a 32-year-old sergeant from Texas with a cocky grin and a deep southern drawl; Mike Reynolds, 23, a skinny kid from Ohio who had more opinions than sense; Ethan Blake, 27, quiet and watchful, always hanging back; and Lieutenant Jack Harrison, 35, a hardened but fair man from Chicago who seemed more focused on results than the men under his command. It wasn't long before Marcus found himself isolated. During training drills, when they were supposed to work in pairs, the others would glance around, avoiding eye contact, until Marcus was left standing alone. In the mess hall, when he sat down, conversations would abruptly stop. He tried to brush it off, telling himself it didn't matter, that he wasn't here to make friends. But the jokes, always just loud enough for him to hear, cut deeper than he let on. "Hey, Williams," Brad Coleman would say, grinning across the barracks. "Hope you're not gonna slow us down when we hit the field. Ain't no time for taking breaks in a real war zone." "Yeah, we don't need no hero complex either," Mike Reynolds chimed in, smirking. "Just stay in line, rookie." Marcus clenched his fists but didn't respond. He knew better. His grandmother had taught him that silence could be louder than any words, that dignity was in how you carried yourself, not in how you responded to ignorance. Still, the weight of their stares, the quiet snickers, it all started to build, brick by brick, like a wall pressing in on him from all sides. One night, as Marcus lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling, he thought about quitting. Was it worth it? Was this what he had signed up for? The army was supposed to be about unity, about having each other's backs, not about dividing by color. But then he thought of his grandmother, of how proud she had been when he showed her the enlistment papers. He thought of all the sacrifices his family had made, and he knew he couldn't let them down. Not now. Training only got tougher as the days wore on. The unit was being prepped for a deployment. Rumors swirled about a mission overseas, somewhere in the Middle East, though the details were classified. Marcus threw himself into the exercises, pushing harder than anyone else, running farther, lifting heavier, firing more rounds at the range. His hands blistered, his muscles ached, but he didn't stop. If they were going to judge him, they were at least going to respect his work ethic. But respect seemed far off. One afternoon during a grueling obstacle course, Marcus was halfway up the rope climb when Brad Coleman, standing below, called out, "Come on, Williams. Don't let that weight hold you down." Laughter erupted from the others. Marcus gritted his teeth, pulling himself up hand over hand, sweat pouring down his face. He reached the top, breathless, and sat for a moment, looking out over the training ground, the sun beating down on the dusty field. For a split second, he let himself feel the anger, deep, burning anger at the injustice of it all, but he knew he couldn't let it consume him. He had to be better than that. Better than them. After the drill, as the unit gathered in formation, Lieutenant Harrison approached Marcus quietly. "Good work out there, Williams. Keep it up." It was the first time anyone had acknowledged his efforts, and while Harrison's words were brief, they meant more to Marcus than he could say. Maybe not everyone saw him the same way. Maybe there was hope. That night, though, hope felt distant. The barracks were alive with whispers. Mike Reynolds had apparently gotten his hands on a bottle of whiskey, and the group gathered around, laughing and swapping stories. When Marcus approached, the conversation died, and Brad Coleman gave him a look that sent a clear message: "You're not welcome here." Feeling the familiar sting of rejection, Marcus turned and walked outside. He stood under the stars, breathing in the cool night air, trying to steady the emotions swirling inside him. It wasn't fair. None of it was fair. But the war was coming, and with it, a chance to prove himself, not to them, maybe, but to himself. The next morning, the announcement came. Their unit was being deployed to a combat zone in the Middle East. The air in the barracks shifted instantly, from playful tension to quiet dread. The jokes stopped. The whispers faded. Even Brad Coleman's smirk seemed to falter. As Marcus packed his gear, he felt a strange mix of fear and determination. The battlefield didn't care about race. Bullets didn't ask for skin color. And when the time came, Marcus vowed to show them who he really was, not just a black man from Atlanta, not just the quiet guy in the back of the room, but a soldier. One they could count on, whether they knew it yet or not. The mission was coming. And so was Marcus's moment. The desert heat was unforgiving, a searing wall of wind and sand that seemed determined to break even the strongest men. Marcus Williams wiped the sweat from his brow as he crouched behind a battered Humvee, heart pounding in his chest. The air smelled like burnt fuel and gunpowder, the distant sounds of machine gun fire echoing across the dunes. It had been 3 weeks since their unit arrived in the Middle East, stationed at a remote outpost known as Firebase Orion. The base was little more than a cluster of tents, sandbags, and armored vehicles, surrounded by endless stretches of desert. The mission? Routine patrols, intelligence gathering, and, when necessary, direct engagement with insurgent forces that lurked in the shadows, waiting for their chance to strike. From the moment they touched down, the tension had been palpable. The men who had mocked Marcus back at Fort Bragg, Brad Coleman, Mike Reynolds, and the others, were quieter now, their bravado worn thin by the constant threat of attack. Even Brad's usual cocky grin had faded into a tight, grim line. They were all learning the same hard lesson: war didn't care who you were back home. War had no time for jokes. But that didn't mean the old habits disappeared entirely. During downtime in the mess tent, the glances still came, the quiet conversations that stopped when Marcus entered. He caught Brad and Mike snickering one night over a game of cards, their whispers sharp and cutting: "Let's hope the rookie doesn't get us killed out there." Marcus clenched his jaw but said nothing. There was no point. Words weren't going to change their minds. The days blurred together, patrol after patrol, sand in their boots, adrenaline surging through their veins. Marcus learned to keep his head on a swivel, his rifle close, his senses sharp. He was a natural, steady under pressure, quick to adapt, always watching for signs of trouble. Lieutenant Harrison noticed. Williams, Harrison said after a particularly brutal patrol where Marcus had spotted an IED before anyone else, potentially saving the convoy. "Good eyes out there. You might have just saved half the unit." Marcus nodded, the praise washing over him like a warm wave. But the others? They stayed quiet. Brad Coleman shot him a look, half resentment, half something else, but said nothing. Then came the mission that changed everything. It was a moonless night, the air thick with tension as the unit loaded into their vehicles. The intel had been vague: an insurgent cell gathering in an abandoned village 10 miles east of the base. The objective was simple: sweep and clear, secure the area, gather intel. But in war, nothing was ever simple. As they rolled into the village, Marcus felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. It was too quiet. The buildings, crumbling and scorched from years of conflict, loomed like hollow ghosts. The wind whispered through broken windows. Lieutenant Harrison gave the signal, and the men fanned out, rifles raised, eyes scanning the shadows. They hadn't gone 50 yards when the first explosion rocked the street. An IED buried under the sand erupted in a fireball, flipping the lead Humvee like a toy. Shouts filled the air: chaos, panic, dust choking their lungs. Gunfire erupted from rooftops, a rain of bullets tearing through the night. Ambush! Harrison's voice roared over the comms. Take cover! Return fire! Marcus dove behind a crumbling wall, heart hammering. The scene was a nightmare: men screaming, bullets ricocheting, the smell of burning fuel. He could see Brad Coleman pinned behind a disabled Humvee, blood soaking his sleeve, his face pale. Mike Reynolds was yelling into the radio, trying to call for support, but the signal was jammed. For a split second, Marcus froze. He could stay down, wait it out, like the others were doing. Or he could act. His grandmother's voice echoed in his head, "They can't take your pride unless you let them." Marcus surged to his feet. "Cover me," he shouted, voice hoarse. Without waiting for a response, he sprinted across the open street, bullets zipping past his head like angry wasps. His boots pounded the sand, every muscle screaming, but he didn't stop. He reached Brad's position, dropping into cover beside him. "You good?" Marcus shouted, grabbing Brad's shoulder. Brad stared at him, wide-eyed, as if seeing Marcus for the first time. I think I'm hit." Marcus didn't hesitate. He tore a strip of fabric from his own uniform, tying a makeshift tourniquet around Brad's arm, tightening it until Brad hissed in pain. "You're not dying here, man. Not on my watch." He turned, firing a burst toward the rooftops, forcing the insurgents to duck. His mind was a blur of calculations, where the enemy was, where his men were pinned, how to get them out. He spotted Mike, still desperately yelling into the broken radio, and Ethan Blake, lying motionless in the sand, blood pooling beneath him. No time for fear. "Coleman, stay low," Marcus barked. Then he took off again, zigzagging through the gunfire, reaching Ethan's side. His hands moved on instinct, checking for a pulse. Weak, but there. He hoisted Ethan onto his shoulders, staggering under the weight, and half ran, half crawled toward cover, bullets kicking up sand all around him. One by one, Marcus rallied the scattered men, dragging them to safety, barking orders like a man possessed. Harrison's voice came through the comms, rough but alive. "Williams! What the hell are you doing out there? Saving your asses!" Marcus shouted, teeth gritted. It felt like an eternity, but somehow, Marcus kept moving, kept fighting, until the distant rumble of Apache helicopters signaled that backup had arrived. The insurgents melted into the darkness, leaving behind the echoes of gunfire and the smell of smoke. When the dust finally settled, the unit was battered but alive. Marcus stood in the middle of the street, chest heaving, his uniform torn and bloodied. Brad Coleman sat against the Humvee, staring at Marcus like he was seeing a ghost. "Williams," he muttered, voice hoarse. You saved us." Marcus looked at him, sweat dripping into his eyes. For a moment, the weight of everything, of the racism, the isolation, the unspoken resentment, seemed to hang in the air between them. But in that moment, none of it mattered. "I did what I had to do," Marcus said quietly. And for the first time, Brad didn't have a smart remark. He just nodded, eyes wide, as if understanding something he'd never seen before. The next few days passed in a haze of exhaustion and disbelief. Firebase Orion, once a place where Marcus felt like an outsider, had shifted. It wasn't an overnight change, prejudices don't vanish in an instant, but the air felt different. The men who had once mocked him now met his eyes a little longer, their expressions tinged with something unfamiliar, respect. Brad Coleman, of all people, was the first to break the unspoken barrier. It was after the debrief, the sun sinking low over the desert, casting long shadows across the base. Marcus sat alone by a crate, cleaning his rifle, the smell of gun oil thick in the air. His hands moved on autopilot, but his mind replayed the ambush over and over, the screams, the explosions, the terrifying weight of Ethan's limp body in his arms. "Williams!" The voice was quiet but firm. Marcus looked up to see Brad standing a few feet away, arms crossed, a pained expression on his face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant whir of generators and the muffled laughter of soldiers inside the tent. "I owe you my life," Brad said finally, voice tight. He shifted uncomfortably, as if the words were foreign in his mouth. "And, I'm sorry." Marcus stared at him, heart thudding. Brad's face was a battlefield, pride warring with guilt, shame tangled with gratitude. It was a strange thing, watching a man who had once treated you like less than human now struggle to acknowledge your worth. "I was wrong about you, man," Brad continued, his voice cracking slightly. "All of us were." Marcus let the words hang in the air for a moment before answering. "You weren't wrong about me, Brad. You just never took the time to see me." Brad blinked, looking like he'd been punched in the gut. Then, slowly, he nodded, and without another word, he walked away. The days that followed were a whirlwind. The brass back at command had heard about Marcus's actions, and word spread fast. Lieutenant Harrison pulled him aside during a supply run, his voice low but sincere. "You're a hell of a soldier, Williams. We need more men like you." Even the grizzled old sergeant, Frank Miller, the one who'd once grumbled about rookies not knowing their place, clapped Marcus on the shoulder in the mess hall, a rare grin tugging at his weathered face. But not everyone was ready to welcome Marcus with open arms. Mike Reynolds, the radio operator, still kept his distance. He'd lost a friend in the ambush. Ethan Blake had succumbed to his wounds during the medevac flight, and Marcus could see the bitterness etched into Mike's features. Grief twisted people in strange ways, and Mike's anger seemed to focus on Marcus, as if saving some lives wasn't enough when another had been lost. It was during a supply convoy a week later that the tension boiled over. The unit was escorting trucks through a narrow canyon, an ideal spot for an ambush, and everyone knew it. Marcus was riding shotgun in the lead Humvee, scanning the rocky outcrops with narrowed eyes, every muscle taut. The radio crackled with static, Mike's voice sharp and clipped as he relayed updates. Suddenly, a sharp crack split the air, a sniper's bullet, whistling past Marcus's head. The convoy erupted in chaos, trucks swerving, dust clouds billowing. The driver of the lead truck slammed on the brakes, sending a crate of supplies tumbling onto the sand. "Sniper! 11 o'clock!" Marcus shouted, already swinging his rifle toward the flash of movement on the ridge. But as Marcus took aim, he felt it eyes on him. Turning slightly, he caught Mike's glare in the rearview mirror. The bitterness, the resentment, it was all there, simmering just beneath the surface. Then Mike did something that made Marcus's blood run cold. He hesitated. Just for a split second, but in a firefight, a second is a lifetime. Marcus's call for suppressing fire was met with silence, and in that moment, the sniper fired again. The bullet struck the convoy commander's side mirror, shattering it in a burst of glass. Marcus barely had time to react. He threw open the door, dropping into the sand as the sniper adjusted his aim for a third shot. Without waiting for backup, Marcus charged forward, zigzagging through the rocks. The adrenaline coursed through his veins, every sense sharpened. He scaled the ridge, ignoring the sting of shrapnel grazing his arm. As he crested the top, he spotted the sniper, an insurgent in a tattered scarf, reloading his rifle. Marcus didn't hesitate. He fired a burst, dropping the man before he could get another shot off. The fight was over as quickly as it began. Marcus stood over the fallen enemy, chest heaving, his hands trembling from the adrenaline. Below, the convoy regrouped, soldiers checking their weapons, their wounded, their trucks. When Marcus returned to the Humvee, Mike was waiting. His face was pale, eyes darting nervously. He started, but Marcus held up a hand. "Save it," Marcus said, his voice low but steady. "Out here, hesitation gets people killed." Mike swallowed hard, nodding, shame written across his features. That night, back at the base, the mood was somber. They'd made it back alive, but the cracks in the unit's foundation were starting to show. Marcus lay awake in his bunk, staring at the canvas ceiling, the sounds of the desert wind whispering outside. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going to let bitterness or hate define him. He was here to do a job, and he would do it well, no matter who doubted him, no matter how many sideways glances he got. Because out here, in the brutal heat of war, action spoke louder than words, and Marcus Williams's actions had already spoken volumes. The days bled into nights, the relentless heat of the desert sun replaced by the eerie chill of darkness. Marcus Williams could feel the shift in the unit, not just in the subtle nods of acknowledgement or the rare claps on the shoulder, but in the way they listened when he spoke, the way they moved when he gave orders. Yet, deep down, Marcus knew respect was a fragile thing in the military, especially for a black man wearing the same uniform as those who had once mocked him. It wasn't over. It never was. The morning after the sniper attack, the squad was ordered to prep for a mission deep into insurgent territory. The tension was palpable. They were low on supplies, stretched thin, and the roads were a labyrinth of danger. It was a mission they couldn't afford to fail, but Marcus couldn't shake the weight of Mike Reynolds' hesitation the day before. Trust was everything out here, and Marcus wasn't sure if Mike had his back when it truly mattered. Lieutenant Harrison gathered the men in the dusty yard, the sun barely rising over the jagged hills. His voice was clipped. All business. We're heading to Al-Qadir. Intel says insurgents are stockpiling weapons in the village. We'll be the tip of the spear. Questions? Silence. Harrison's gaze lingered on Marcus for a beat longer than necessary, as if silently acknowledging his role in holding the unit together. Then he dismissed them, and the men scattered to load their gear. As Marcus checked his rifle, he felt a presence behind him. He turned to find Ethan Blake's younger brother, Corporal Jamie Blake, standing there, his face tight. "Hey, Williams," Jamie said quietly, shifting on his feet. His voice was calm, but his eyes burned with something deeper, something raw. "I heard what you did for my brother. I didn't get a chance to say it before, but thank you." Marcus's heart twisted. Ethan's death still weighed heavily on the unit, a silent shadow haunting every patrol. He nodded, placing a hand on Jamie's shoulder. "I did what anyone would have done." Jamie shook his head. "No, man. Not anyone. Some of them, they still don't see you. But I do. My brother did too. You're a damn good soldier." Before Marcus could reply, Jamie turned and walked away, leaving Marcus staring at the cracked earth beneath his boots. The mission to Al-Qadir was a nightmare from the start. They rolled out in a convoy of 3 Humvees, the dust choking their lungs, visibility limited to a few feet. The air was thick with tension, every soldier gripping their weapons tighter than usual. Marcus sat behind the driver, scanning the horizon, the weight of responsibility pressing down on his shoulders. The ambush hit them hard. A hidden IED detonated beneath the lead vehicle, the explosion ripping through metal and flesh in a deafening blast. The world seemed to tilt, smoke filling Marcus's lungs as he tumbled from the Humvee, disoriented but alive. Chaos erupted, bullets zipped through the air, shouts and screams merging into a hellish symphony. Marcus hit the ground running, instincts taking over. He fired at the insurgents emerging from the alleyways, picking them off with precise, controlled bursts. The enemy had them pinned, and their comms were down. Mike Reynolds' radio had been damaged in the blast. It was then Marcus noticed Jamie Blake, trapped behind the wreckage of the lead Humvee, clutching his leg, blood pooling beneath him. Marcus's heart clenched. He didn't think, he just moved. He sprinted across the kill zone, bullets sparking off the pavement around him. He could hear Brad shouting, "Marcus! Get down," but he didn't stop. He reached Jamie, grabbing him by the vest and dragging him behind a makeshift barricade of debris. "Stay with me, man," Marcus yelled, ripping a tourniquet from his kit and cinching it tight above Jamie's thigh. The younger man grimaced in pain but nodded, teeth clenched. They were sitting ducks. Marcus's mind raced. There was no way out, no way to call for backup. Unless the comms unit. If he could get to the destroyed radio in the lead Humvee, maybe, just maybe, he could patch it together enough to send a distress signal. It was a suicide mission, but it was their only shot. "I'm going for the radio," Marcus shouted to Brad and Mike, who were hunkered down behind an overturned crate. Mike's face went pale, but Brad nodded sharply. "I'll cover you," Brad called, raising his rifle and laying down suppressive fire. Marcus darted out, zigzagging toward the smoking remains of the Humvee. The heat from the flames scorched his skin, but he pushed through, wrenching open the door and yanking the damaged radio free. He tore into the wires, his hands moving on instinct, the training kicking in. Sweat dripped into his eyes, mixing with the grime on his skin, but he barely noticed. Come on, he muttered, splicing wires with a knife, connecting the bare ends, sparks flying dangerously close to the leaking fuel. His breath caught. This was it. One wrong move, and the whole thing could blow. Finally, the radio crackled, a faint burst of static. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Alpha Unit, pinned down at Al-Qadir, requesting immediate support. Casualties reported, repeat, casualties reported." The signal was weak, but it was something. Marcus sent the message twice, then yanked the radio free, sprinting back to cover just as another explosion rocked the street behind him. Minutes later, the distinct thump of Apache rotors filled the air, a sound Marcus would never forget. Air support rained down hell on the insurgents, and the tide turned. They had survived, barely. When the dust settled, the unit regrouped, battered but alive. Jamie was evacuated by medics, and Marcus sat in the dirt, breathing hard, his hands shaking. Brad approached, kneeling beside him. His voice was hoarse. "You saved us. Again." Marcus looked up, meeting Brad's gaze, and for the first time, he saw no trace of the old sneer, no lingering resentment. Just gratitude. Mike, too, approached, his eyes downcast, guilt etched into every line of his face. "Williams, I." Marcus shook his head, holding up a hand. "It's done. We've got a job to do." They sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of the medevac choppers fading into the distance. The weight of what had happened settled over them like a blanket, heavy and suffocating. But in that moment, something shifted. The men who had doubted him, mocked him, even hated him, they couldn't deny it anymore. Marcus Williams was more than just the color of his skin. He was a soldier. A leader. A hero. And for the first time, the respect he'd fought so hard for wasn't just a grudging acknowledgement, it was real. The weeks following the ambush at Al-Qadir were a blur of exhaustion, dust, and a new, unspoken bond that wove itself through the unit like a lifeline. The men were different now. Marcus could see it in the way they looked at him, the way they listened when he spoke. No one laughed at his presence anymore, no one whispered behind his back. The sneers and side eyes had faded, replaced by nods of respect, and in some cases, even a rare smile. But Marcus knew better than to believe the fight was over. Respect in the military wasn't a prize you earned once, it was a constant battle, and for a black man like Marcus, it was a battle fought on two fronts, the enemy outside the wire and the ghosts inside it. The racism hadn't vanished overnight. It lingered in the small things, the subtle hesitations, the quiet looks. And sometimes, it boiled over in dangerous ways. It started with a routine patrol. The unit was rolling through a narrow village road, the Humvees kicking up clouds of dust, when they were flagged down by a group of locals near a dilapidated school building. Marcus, sitting in the passenger seat, scanned the scene. Something felt off. The locals looked nervous, too eager to get the soldiers' attention. "Eyes up," Marcus muttered into the radio, his gut screaming. Brad, now sitting in the turret, swung his machine gun in a slow arc, watching. Mike Reynolds, in the second Humvee, shifted uncomfortably, sweat beading on his forehead. Suddenly, from a nearby alley, a young insurgent burst out, RPG on his shoulder. Time slowed. "RPG!" Marcus shouted, lunging forward. The Humvees erupted into a frenzy of movement. Marcus didn't think, he tackled the nearest soldier, Private Ortega, slamming them both into the dirt just as the rocket screamed past, slamming into a nearby wall in a fiery explosion. The air filled with screams, smoke, and the deafening ring of shrapnel tearing through metal. Marcus rolled onto his back, ears ringing, as the insurgents poured out of the alleyways, weapons blazing. He grabbed Ortega's vest and dragged him behind cover, returning fire in tight bursts. The team responded like a well-oiled machine, but chaos still reigned. Brad was barking orders, but his voice was strained, panic creeping in. Then Marcus heard it, the unmistakable sound of a grenade clattering near their position. Time froze. Without thinking, Marcus threw himself over the grenade, adrenaline surging through every nerve. The blast ripped through the air, but Marcus had smothered the worst of it. Pain exploded in his side, a burning agony that stole his breath, but he stayed conscious, gritting his teeth. "Williams!" Brad's voice was hoarse, panicked. Mike and Jamie sprinted toward him, dragging him back, their faces pale. Blood pooled beneath Marcus, staining the dirt, but he clenched his jaw, refusing to let it end here. I'm good," he grunted, though the world swam in and out of focus. His hand trembled as he gripped Jamie's arm, bloodied but alive. It took hours for the dust to settle and for medics to stabilize Marcus enough for transport. The pain was searing, but in the back of the Humvee, Marcus forced himself to sit up, wincing, because he saw something in the eyes of the men around him that he'd never seen before. Not just respect. Not just gratitude. Loyalty. Brad leaned in, his voice low but fierce. You're a damn hero, Marcus. Don't you forget that. For a moment, Marcus thought back to the early days, the mockery, the isolation, the humiliation. And now? These men would follow him into hell. They had followed him into hell, and he'd dragged them back. But the war wasn't over, not out there, and not in their hearts. Back at base, as Marcus lay in the medical tent, stitched up but still aching, a new ripple began to spread through the unit. Word of what he'd done, diving on the Grenade, saving Ortega, holding the line when others would have run, echoed through the ranks. Men who had barely spoken to him before approached his cot, some with tears in their eyes, some with quiet words. Williams, I misjudged you. I'm sorry. You're the real deal, man. I'd fight beside you any day. Even the higher-ups took notice. Lieutenant Harrison visited Marcus personally, a rare move for the officer known for keeping his distance. He stood stiffly at the foot of the cot, his face tight with something like respect. I've recommended you for a commendation, Williams, he said simply. The men are alive because of you. That's what leadership looks like. Marcus could barely process the words. Commendation? He hadn't done it for the medals or the glory. He'd done it because those men were his. They were family, no matter how much they'd hated him at first. They were bound by the battlefield, by the shared knowledge of fear, loss, and survival. But even in the glow of hard-won respect, Marcus knew there were battles yet to come. A week later, as he limped out of the medical tent, Marcus overheard a conversation that stopped him cold. Two soldiers he barely knew, new transfers, were talking in low voices, their words laced with the poison Marcus knew too well. I don't care what he did, one of them muttered. He's still just a... Marcus froze, the old rage flaring in his chest. The words stung, sharper than the shrapnel that had torn through his side. He clenched his fists, ready to confront them, but then, he saw Brad step up behind them, his face hard as granite. You finish that sentence, Brad growled, and you'll be eating dirt. That man saved all our lives. You show some respect. The soldiers fell silent, their eyes wide, and Brad turned, catching Marcus's gaze. For a moment, they stared at each other, and then Brad gave a small nod and unspoken promise. Marcus felt something settle inside him. The fight wasn't over, no. Racism didn't vanish with a single act of heroism. But he wasn't fighting alone anymore. For the first time, Marcus Williams wasn't just the black soldier who survived. He was the man who had changed the hearts of his brothers in arms, one battle at a time. The weeks after the battle felt like a blur for Marcus. His injuries healed faster than expected, but it was the emotional weight that lingered. He often sat alone under the desert stars, questioning if the respect he'd earned was real, or just a momentary shift in the heat of war. But the men around him started showing that change wasn't just a fleeting thing. One evening, Brad approached him, his voice low and different than before. I never really said it, but you saved us, man. You saved me, he admitted, eyes heavy with guilt and gratitude. Marcus looked at him quietly, then nodded. We all bleed the same, Brad. Took you long enough to figure it out. The next day, in the mess hall, Lieutenant Harrison called Marcus to the front, presenting him with the Bronze Star. The room burst into applause, loud, genuine, unrestrained. Marcus held the medal, his hands steady, and realized it wasn't just metal and ribbon. It was a symbol that his sacrifice mattered. That he was no longer the black guy they didn't trust, but a leader, a brother in arms. After the ceremony, as they sat around the fire, Brad raised his canteen. To Williams. Our brother. Our leader. Marcus smiled, lifting his own. To all of us. Brothers in arms. The cheers echoed into the desert night, sealing a bond forged in fire, loss, and redemption. Marcus knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But for the first time, he felt like he truly belonged. And that was worth every battle he had fought.